So, hey y'all, thanks for joining our webinar, talking about poverty and economic opportunity, shifting the narrative. I'm Will Coley. I'm communications coordinator at the Opportunity Agenda and the moderator today. So, as you may know, the Opportunity Agenda is a social justice communication lab. We work with partners to move hearts and minds towards lasting policy and culture change. And today we're going to discuss how to tell a new story about economic opportunity. And to help do that, we're sharing our new messaging pillars. We've got three great speakers who will talk about their work and how they plan to use the pillars. They're Marisol Bello of Community Change. You there, Marisol?
Yes, I'm here. Super excited to be here. Good afternoon, everyone.
Great. Bill Nichols from Spotlight on Poverty.
Great to be on. Hi, everybody.
And Charon Hribar from the Kairos Center and the Poor People's Campaign.
Hi, everyone. Excited to talk with you all today.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us. So we'll take questions at the end of the webinar, so feel free to enter any questions you have into the chat box or questions function on the GoToWebinar toolbar on the right. And you can join the conversation on Twitter as well by using the hashtag #EconOp4All. It's that hashtag down in the bottom right corner. And after the webinar, there's going to be a short evaluation that will pop up on your screen. Please take a few seconds to fill it out so that we can improve future webinars based on your feedback. Okay, so let's get started. So you're probably well aware that each week the Trump administration finds new ways to whittle away at the programs that help families who are struggling to make ends meet. And I know it's tempting to refute his negative messages. The problem is that doing that is that we can reinforce misinformation and stereotypes often about people living in poverty. And we want to build a shared narrative with affirmative values that shifts the way our nation talks about and addresses economic opportunity. So as I just mentioned, we created three core messaging pillars in collaboration with some of our partners. These pillars offer tips for discussing shared values, naming systemic causes of poverty, and highlighting solutions that work. And you can use them to help shape your communications, from press releases to social media to on-air interviews. So I'm just going to go over the three pillars briefly now. The first one is connections. And by connections, we mean that we move forward together. And by this, we're saying that we should discredit any distinctions that pit us versus them and divide us, particularly along racial and ethnic lines. And that we should highlight the goals that we all have in common and to be very explicit about what those goals are. To be able to provide for our families, to live in healthy and thriving communities, and watch our children move forward in life. And we should use language that emphasizes how everyone benefits when our public policies and programs allow all of our communities to thrive. Oh, and I should also mention this art is by Nina Montenegro. She's an artist that we worked with to create these images that are also available on our website for you to use in any of your communications work. The second pillar is solutions. When we can create an economy that works for us all, with our government playing a key role. And the thing with talking about solutions is to push back on this idea that poverty is somehow inevitable. And we need to remind people that poverty is the result of deliberate policies that benefit some over others. And we have to center ourselves in the abundance frame, that there's enough to go around and that we can achieve true economic opportunity for everyone. It's important to understand that poverty is within our reach. Ending poverty is within our reach. And pillar three is about justice. We all have a responsibility to address systemic injustice. And when you talk to most Americans, they agree that today's current economic system is off track. And that's because of systemic injustices, not the sum of individuals' personal choices. Today, it's, as you know, politicians attack anti-poverty programs and policies based on deep-seated stereotypes or short-term political goals. And then we have to remind audiences that a just economic system works for everyone, regardless of what you look like or where you come from, and that workers have more in common with each other and greater interest in each other's well-being than corporations and the 1% do. So that's kind of the three in a nutshell. We also, this is, as I said, available on our website at this link. Or you can also go to our website and search for pillars, and you'll find this document. It's also a PDF which you can download and use. And also in the PDF and on the website, there's suggested language for how we can talk about these pillars, these messaging ideas with the audiences we work with. So if you have any questions about this, you can start leaving messages in the chat box to your right. So first off, I wanted to talk more about this is Marisol Bello from Community Change. Marisol, you're there, right?
Yes. How are you?
Yeah, great. Can you tell us more about the work you're doing leading on economic opportunity?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Marisol Bello, and I'm the Comms Director for Community Change. Thank you so much, Will, and thank you, everyone. I'm very excited to spend the next hour with all of you. Just really quickly, I want to tell you Community Change is a 50-year-old organization, and our work is all around building grassroots movements around issues that help people thrive, right? Economic justice, housing, childcare, immigration. And the Fellows program are really a textbook example almost to how you can put the pillars that Will just spoke about into practice. We started the Comms Fellows program about 4 years ago because we realized in so much of our communications that the narrative and the narrative around people struggling to get by, the policies that affected people struggling to get by, the laws and the changes, that was all being driven by people who were not impacted. And so we wanted to try to figure out how do we make sure that impacted people were the co-pilots, right? How were they leading the changes and policies that affect them? And one of the key areas that we realize just in our daily life, right? When we connect with something or an issue or a person, it's around their stories. And it gets to the sort of the first pillar, right? Connections. We move forward together. And we realized, okay, well, we have a lot of folks who are impacted who are not telling their stories. How do we get them to tell their stories? So we started this program of people with lived experiences, the authentic voices, right? The folks who live in our communities who are single moms struggling to get by, immigrants who were raised in this country as undocumented, children, parents struggling with childcare, families dealing with generational poverty, right? And we created this network of authentic voices, of storytellers, and they tell their stories, their experiences, and those of their communities, so that they are driving the policies. So some examples would be a fellow who was living in poverty, and she is a single mom, writing about the need for food stamps and how food stamps helped her family to thrive, or a college student who needed food stamps when she was in college in order to have enough to eat. So they write essays that we have published in media outlets. They are videographers and podcasters. They are photographers. You name the platform and the medium that a story can be told, our fellows are telling it in those stories and using those platforms. Our writers tend to have their work published in national and local outlets like the New York Times or the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Our videographers, for example, tell video stories on what it's like to live in the hustle economy, right? And have 3 or 4 different jobs that you are, really working, several gigs, right, in the gig economy. And those videos will be published on our editorial platform that we've created called ChangeWire. And so this is really about how do we shape the narrative, right? How do we have the people who are most affected with the authentic voices who live in communities who are feeling the impact of policies sometimes made inside the Beltway, for those of you that live in DC, but they live all over the country. And what does that mean for them? If there are efforts to try to repeal healthcare and they need healthcare, if there are efforts to reduce or cut the safety net, and the safety net is what's helped them and their families to thrive. And that's really the role of the fellows. And we really follow these pillars or something like it in terms of having our folks have a shared value. They talk about the solutions that are best for impacted communities. And then because it's such a diverse group of people, we really highlight and spotlight gender, social, and racial justice issues. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.
Oh, yeah.
Can I just highlight really quickly, we have a fellow who actually had her memoir published earlier this year. Her name is Stephanie Land. You might have seen her book at Barnes & Noble or wherever your local bookstore is. It's a New York Times bestseller, and it really is about a period of time in her life when she worked as a maid, struggling to make ends meet and raising her daughter. She lives in a homeless shelter for part of that time. So our fellows just have really are sharing their stories far and wide. I'm sorry, Will, go ahead.
So how do y'all facilitate placing these stories on the platform? What is the editorial involvement of community change on these individual stories? Yeah,
thank you. That's a great question, and a question that we get a lot. So the first thing I should tell you is that I am a former reporter. As of 4 years ago, my entire life was in journalism. And so to some extent, I went back to what I know, which is creating a newsroom of sorts for our fellows. And the fellows essentially work as reporters, right? They are storytellers. They're not journalists in that there's a different set of criteria, obviously, to be a journalist. Here they are very much working around the advocacy lens, but we've set it up like a newsroom. So we have the fellows who act as reporters and writers and storytellers. And then we have staff, myself included, who are their editors, and we work with them, right? They will write about issues that are in the news and providing that context and providing the context around an issue from the perspective of someone who's lived it. So you'll see in this slide, we have a piece that ran in the New York Times from one of our fellows, Debbie Weingarten, and it's titled, "My Children Were Denied Passports Because They Were Delivered by a Midwife." You might remember that a few months ago, the Trump administration was denying passports to children who were born along the border. And Debbie's two boys were born in Arizona and delivered by a midwife, and she tried to get them passports, and they are also Latino. And she tried to get them passports, and they were denied. And needless to say, Debbie was not a happy camper and came to myself and her editor first to say, this is really making me crazy. What is going on here? And she wrote this really eloquent, beautiful piece about her children not being able to get passports, and they obviously were born and raised in this country. You'll see the other story there about how Memphis gave up on King's Dream was a fellow named Wendy Thomas, who runs a journalistic platform called MLK 50, and it started last year. It was looking at the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination in Memphis, and she really dissected all of the areas that he was focused on, income inequality, poverty, and how that all was playing out in Memphis, and how Memphis was ground zero for so many of these issues, and the changes and progress or lack thereof in the 50 years that he was killed. And so she wrote a piece that also ran in the New York Times. And so we have our fellows really look at what's happening in the news, because we know that obviously to get our pieces published, having context that and having a news hook is really critical, and having a strong perspective on whatever the news of the day is.
And I know Community Change is an organization of community organizers. So how is this program organizing?
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a great question, right? I mean, so much of our work is making sure that when we are building power in our communities, that impacted people must lead in the changes and policies, right, that affect them. But that also means that they have to lead in communications and in the narratives around the issues that affect them as well. And so much, again, of the narratives are built and maintained by others who either have a political agenda or who have no real experience about what it is. And so often we will hear things like people living in poverty are victims, right? Because that's a trope, or they're moochers of the system, because that also is a trope. And so here we are having impacted people tell their stories and really helping us to create a story chamber and establish the narrative one story at a time. And that our goal is that each person who reads a piece in the New York Times by one of our fellows, or in The Guardian or the Washington Post by one of our fellows, will shift their thinking just that much more around what it means to struggle to get by, or will say, oh man, I know exactly where Stephanie Land is. I know exactly what she's talking about. The same thing happened to me. I have to raise my voice in a similar kind of way. And so our organizing is around establishing the narrative and helping people understand that this is not about individual failings of people. This is about there's a system out there that really hurts folks. And what better way to understand that than from the very perspective of the people that are experiencing it and affected by it.
That's great. Well, I'm sure folks will have some more questions, and maybe we'll come back to you at the end, Marisol, but thanks so much for that.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you.
Next up is Bill Nichols from Spotlight on Poverty. Thanks again, Bill, for joining us.
Happy to do it, Will. Glad to be here.
So tell us, what is Spotlight? How are you covering poverty and economic opportunity?
Well, Spotlight is not dissimilar in a lot of ways from community change. Excuse me. And interestingly, Marisol and I were colleagues in years past. I'm also a recovering journalist, and Marisol and I worked together at USA Today back in the day. And Spotlight, the difference for us is we come at this topic from a nonpartisan lens. So Spotlight is a nonpartisan, obviously nonprofit site that has aggregated and produced content in this space since 2007, when we were founded to bring more attention to poverty policy during the 2008 presidential cycle. And what we do, we curate the news of the day from think tanks, research organizations, academics, elected officials, what's happening on the campaign trail, and from a wide variety of voices, both from progressive organizations and, when it happens, also from organizations on the other side of the aisle. And we have also historically published weekly commentaries and blog posts about events that are going on within the poverty universe in DC. And what's new with us is, since the fall of 2016, we've also begun to scale up a poverty journalism project. And we've published over 40 pieces of reported journalism from across the country using freelancers. And our ultimate ambition for that is to do for this space, the poverty, income inequality space, what Kaiser Health News has done for health, or the Marshall Project has done for criminal justice. And that's to produce quality content that other news organizations can use as they wish. Again, Marisol and her very talented team are doing that at Community Change. We're doing it in a slightly different way, a more traditional, nonpartisan way. But I think we're trying to meet, to some degree, the same need. We don't have to tell people on this call, particularly those who are joining from out in the country, what's happened to local journalism in recent years. And unfortunately, part of that collapse has been specialty reporting. And on this topic, it was really never that robust. but specialty reporting is often the first, when those cuts start to come, it's one of the first things that gets thrown out the door. So what we're trying to do is to begin to offer content that can replace that. And I can talk about our network, Will, if you want to. Thank you.
Oh, yeah,
so
I was going to ask you. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask you about the examples. You just teed up the next slide, so go, it's all yours.
Thank you. So these are some of the organizations that we're partnering with, and those partnerships take on different characteristics. Basically, there's some piece of journalism at the heart of them. We co-publish a story. In some cases, these are skeletal staffs that are looking for editing help, and I can help them with that. In some cases, they need financial help, and we have really prided ourselves on paying very well for this journalism for the freelancers who are doing it for us. Sometimes we're able to help organizations do stories that they otherwise might not be able to do. And other times, we're just looking to share each other's audience. I mean, I think one of the truisms in journalism today is that there are no longer competitors. Everyone is actually a potential partner, and we are certainly an example of that. So these are some of the organizations that we're working with, and that pipeline goes both ways. They're using our work. Increasingly, we're using their work, posting it prominently on the site and making it part of our social media feed. And just the other thing that I would note is we're also working to scale this project up in a new program at Harvard this year, the Media Transformation Challenge. So we're hopeful that we'll come out of that with some new momentum, and would really like to make this a national, a project that has more national scope than it does now. And let me talk, if I can, a little bit for us, how the pillars come into play. Again, in many ways, very similar to what Marisol was saying. I would focus on two of them primarily. The first being the solutions piece. That's always been important to us, and I think particularly now as we're working to build out this network, it's very easy in this space and probably in others to have stories that focus on problems. But we want stories to present potential solutions to problems. And I'll give you an example of a story that we're going to run next week. We're doing a story in partnership with 100 Days in Appalachia on the type 2 diabetes epidemic in that part of the country. And you could easily do a story that looked only at the devastation that disease has caused. But our story will instead obviously reference that, but look at a pilot program that's trying to use community activists, many of whom have no medical background, but can help to begin to fill some of the gaps, particularly with long-term and chronic care and lifestyle practices for patients in remote areas. And the other thing that I would underline is this notion of connections, which I think you'll hear all of us talk about, this small but I think vibrant and growing community of people who are doing content in the poverty and opportunity space. I think there's nothing that's more important to all of us than changing the narrative, as Will spoke about at the beginning. And we feel at Spotlight that even traditional content is a very productive way to do that. It's as simple as our goal is to have our journalism be about us and not them. So how do we do that? It's through the stories we choose. Like Marisol, we're trying when we can to use writers with lived experience. And we also do it outside journalism in our role as a convener. We tend to be the organization that people come to when there are, and it's rare in DC these days, but it still does happen, if there are bipartisan efforts going on in the poverty space, that people are looking for a megaphone to bring attention to those. Spotlight is often who they'll come to. We did events at each of the national political conventions in 2016. And a main goal of that was to try to bridge this gap between the real people who live in Philadelphia and Cleveland and this horde of people who were visiting, but who might never get a sense of what life in those cities was really like.
That's great. So are you looking for pitches, and what do you look for in a
Absolutely.
In a pitch?
For us, it's a variety of things. Again, we're looking for stories that, when possible, that spotlight a solution. Increasingly, we're looking for real geographic diversity. Our initial funding was focused largely on the South, but we have increasingly built out of that, and now we did a story out of Puerto Rico, we did a story out of Hawaii. So the more geographical mix we can have, and interesting human stories. We don't tend to do political stories. We don't tend to do process stories. Stories that can highlight the people who are living out these issues and who can portray them in a dignified, real way, rather than sort of trafficking in the stereotypes that too often is the case.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
My pleasure.
And so finally, I want to turn to Charon Hribar from the Kairos Center. Charon, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Thanks, Will.
Okay. Well, you know, I love how y'all open your events with a song. Could you give us a sample?
Sure, it is definitely one of the ways we communicate our message. So this is one that if you were part of the campaign last year, you would have heard every Monday in over 35 state capitals across the country and in Washington, D.C., as people were getting ready to put their bodies on the line and participate in civil disobedience at their state capitals, so that everyone should have the right to live and to health care, to clean water, to affordable housing, quality education, and so much more. So I'll start with this. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. 'Cause everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. 'Cause everybody's got a right to live.
Oh, that's so great. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So I know that you've had a really, really busy year. Tell us what you've been up to.
Yes, it has for sure. So the Poor People's Campaign was officially launched last spring, just about a year ago on Mother's Day, during the 50th anniversary of the 1968 campaign that Dr. King and others had started. And we launched the campaign not to commemorate the 68 campaign, but as we say, to finish the unfinished business that was started, and to challenge the interlocking evils of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and our nation's distorted moral narrative. And in that 40 days of moral direct action, we had 40 states across the country that were really coming together to shift the moral narrative through sustained direct action. And in that sustained direct action, to demonstrate the power of people coming together across race, across issue, across geography, and all the lines that usually isolate and divide our communities. And so we've been really working since then, to continue to build this broad fusion movement. We're a campaign made up of people of all races, of all ages, old and young. We're of all sexual orientations and gender identities, of all abilities. And we live across this country, as I mentioned, in over 40 states, from Alaska to Florida, from Maine to California. And really trying to, at this stage, and this after that first initial 40 days of action, starting to build deep dive relationships and organizing across the country to be able to learn from one another about how the issues our communities face are interconnected, and how it's only through our coming together that we can build the power necessary to, as Bill was talking about, solve these problems and propose those solutions. And so over this last year, we've continued to, through canvassing during the 2018 midterms, or holding poor people's hearings and town halls. We've led a series of national emergency truth and poverty bus tours in 28 states, and been doing a lot of political education and relationship building. And at the heart of all of that, the role of theomusicology and cultural arts is really there to ground and connect and inspire our movement through the music and the stories and the visual materials that we put forward to spread the message and vision of this work. And so if you stay on this slide here, Will, thinking a little bit about how we do that, and I think this relates to some of what Marisol and Bill are putting out of the importance of stories. You know, the campaign, as I've kind of alluded to, the goals of the Poor People's Campaign have been to shift the narrative, to build power among poor and moral leaders, and to impact elections and policies around these 5 evils of and interlocking evils of racism, poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, and this distorted moral narrative. And what that means for us is really that first, we argue that you have to change the false and limited definition of poverty, and that we've been told, you know, that it's a marginal group of people, or that it's, you know, an isolated group of people. But really, we've really argued that there are 140 million poor and low-income people in the United States, and that many more of us are one paycheck or one healthcare crisis away from experiencing poverty. And at the same time, while arguing that the numbers are much higher than anyone is suggesting in much of the national media or policies, we're also arguing that we're living in a time of great abundance and that ending poverty is possible. So again, connecting to the pillars that Opportunity Agenda is also putting forward. And so shifting the narrative means to show how poverty is not the fault of the people experiencing poverty, but a problem created by an immoral political and economic system that allows a small few to profit while far too many are suffering. And so some of the images that you see in this slide really shows kind of how we put forward a platform for everyday folks that are organizing this campaign to be talking about the realities our communities are facing. And so we talk about not only shifting the narrative, but shifting the narrator, and insisting that those most impacted speak for themselves and are part of the leadership of this campaign across the country. And so whether, as you can kind of see in these different images, whether it be direct actions or a congressional hearing, or even in the Souls of Poor Folk audit that we did in partnership with the Institute for Policy Studies, or in the Truth and Organizing tours, you know, that we're creating spaces where the stories and solutions of everyday people in our communities can be told and be amplified across the country through this network that is the campaign. And so, you know, it's really a chance to say, you know, who are the 140 million people that are poor in this country? And it's, you know, that's nearly 1 in 2 people. And that we are people who lack health care, we lack clean water, we lack living wages, voting rights, debt-free education, but that we're also doing something about it, and that we are actually fighting for, you know, all of these things in our communities. And in the demands of the campaign, and actually we're about to release a moral budget, we're also showing that it's completely possible to have all of these things and to solve these problems. But we have to reprioritize how we're actually, you know, spending the money that is being spent in this country. So yeah, so that's kind of this first part. I wanted to get a little bit more into the culture work, as that's part of the work that I do. If you can go to the next slide, maybe. And so, as I mentioned, you know, so the campaign, the national campaign, is really working to bring people together from different races, different ages, different geographies, experiences, and that has its challenges. And to do that, especially from the ground up, you know, the question of how do we build a shared vision and a shared message across such a diverse campaign that is able to shift the narrative and build that kind of power that is necessary. And so arts and culture has actually played a really important role here. And it's a central part of the organizing, and myself and Yara Allen out of North Carolina are part of a national organizing team, and our role on the national team is to specifically think about the cultural strategy of the campaign on a spiritual, ideological, and tactical level, alongside a whole network of artists and cultural organizers who are based in their states. And so, you know, in thinking about shifting the narrative from the arts and culture perspective, we talk a lot about shifting people's hearts and minds. and reflecting on ways that people connect to one another and what moves us into action. And so I wanted to give one example. You can see these are some beautiful images that we did with the Just Seeds Arts Collective, starting to envision and be able to think about, how are people going to engage ideas that we were trying to put forward during the 40 days of action. But if you could also go to the next slide, Will. In preparing for the 40 days of action last May, one of the first national convenings that we actually did with the campaign was to hold a theomusicology and movement cultural arts convening in Raleigh, North Carolina in February. That was about 3 months before the actual actions would commence. And we brought together over 100 artists, musicians, visual artists, documentarians from about 32 states at that time. And they were artists who were connected to on-the-ground organizing of the campaign in their states. And we brought them together to begin to prepare and strategize for the 40 days of action. And we've started to think, if we're going to shift a distorted moral narrative, we have to think about what are the core message and values and principles that we wanted to share, and how we could share a narrative that would help people actually hear our stories and understand our message. And so for 4 days, we had over 100 artists that were there talking about the history of the original Poor People's Campaign and why we were being called to reignite this campaign today. And we started to create, banners and flags and patches, as you can see in these images here, that would be taken back and used as a template and replicated across the country to create a visual unity alongside the creative diversity that was represented in the campaign. And the visual artwork carried messages like everybody's got the right to live, somebody's hurting my sister, and we won't be silent anymore. You can see here, fight poverty, not the poor. And all this messaging really rose up from the on-the-ground organizing, and we were able to amplify that nationally through this shared artwork as well. If you can switch to the next slide. And the messages of our visual materials were also echoed in the lyrics of the songs that we came together to share and learn and take back with us, and probably vice versa. A lot of the songs actually helped to create the slogans for the visual arts. But we created actually music videos of the songs of the campaign so that we could have this shared out across the country and people could learn the songs of the campaign. And the song leaders and musicians that came not to just learn it, but to learn to teach the songs as well. And this is a bit of a different skill set than a lot of performing artists are often used to doing. But the goal of the music in this campaign is really to reinvigorate the art of participatory singing that has always been a part of social movements throughout history. And we really wanted to lift that up and have it be a way for people to engage and kind of really embody the messaging that we were pushing forward. And so we used that music and these music videos and all of the artists that went back and started to be song leaders in their states to help ground us and give us courage as we were getting ready to take part in the civil disobedience for 40 days. But it was also a tool, I think, to engage those not yet part of the campaign and who were going to be, basically witnesses to the moral direct action and hear the messaging through the songs and visual materials. And it's amazing to see how people on the side of a street respond when hundreds of people are sitting there singing, somebody's hurting our people and it's gone on far too long and we won't be silent anymore. And people just tend to stop, and they might poke their heads out of their offices in government buildings, or, they're moved to listen a little deeper and hear, I think, what's being said in a different way. So I can stop there. I think there's one more slide. I just wanted to share this as a resource. It's actually up on the Poor People's Campaign website, but again, about how we were able to kind of distribute and share the songs that we were singing and teaching, in the campaign. We created a songbook that's an online resource and continues to grow, actually, of movement songs. And they have lyrics as well as links to either audio or videos so that people could learn how the songs go and be able to use them in their organizing work as well.
Wow, thank you. So I have one question. So why did you choose to call the campaign the Poor People's Campaign and not just the People's Campaign? I understand that, you know, people don't necessarily like to be identified as poor, but and what's the role of non-poor people in the campaign?
Yeah, sure. This is a question we get a lot, and I think it's part of this idea of shifting the narrative, as we've been talking about here, and this idea of being able to destigmatize poverty, and acknowledging that, you know, it's not the fault, it's not our fault that we are experiencing poverty, but that it's a system that's creating poverty for so many of us. And part of that destigmatization was actually to put that up front, and for lots of people to come out and say, hey, I'm struggling and I'm experiencing this reality, and it's not, you know, just somebody over there. And oftentimes we talk so much about the middle class in this country that is, you know, is, we see it deteriorating, and people really, you know, on the brink of losing everything that they have, whether, as I mentioned earlier, whether it be you lose your job, or, you know, you have a healthcare crisis, that so many of us are destabilized in this economy. And we really wanted to put that at the forefront, and to be able to see like how we're connected through that, and to understand that we had to see everyone's experience from a different angle. And that's why, like, people coming together from all over this country, whether you're in a small town or a big city, we have to hear, what does that look like where you are? And so we really understand the problem if we're going to put forward the right solution. So, you know, in addition to being able to draw on the history of an original campaign that was really already starting to do that, we realize today it's even, the problem is even much more pronounced.
Great. Well, thank you, Charon. All three of you are doing such inspiring and vital work. You know, again, I'm so glad that you were able to share that with us today on the webinar. Now it's time for us to take questions from folks who are listening in on the webinar. And so if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat box on the right. And we'll see if we can get as many questions as we can in the time we have remaining. There was a question earlier about how, Marisol, there was a question about recruiting. How do you recruit with people with firsthand experiences living in poverty? And how do you prevent those people from being exploited as the public face of what may be a politically charged issue?
Yeah, that is a super great question. And the first thing, and I should have mentioned this earlier, is that our fellows are paid. We pay them either by there's some fellows that get paid by the content, but most of our fellows are paid a monthly stipend to produce 1 to 3 pieces of content. So it could be one video story, or it could be one video story and 2 essays, or 2 essays, and that really varies by fellow. So that yes, I just want to really reiterate, like, we are trying to fight a narrative here, and we are not perpetuating it, and we really we bring on our fellows as content creators and storytellers, and we pay them for their work. And then how do we recruit folks? So so many avenues. If any of you, I get on webinars and I say, if any of you are interested, please email me at mbello@communitychange.org. So this is one way that I recruit folks. Community Change does so much of its work through grassroots partners across the country. And many of their members, their volunteers, their staffers are writers, aspiring writers, or they are video storytellers who love to use their phones to tell stories and create videos, and they love editing. So it's you may be surprised at how much people have a story that they want to tell, and when given the opportunity, they really jump to it. So we recruit through our grassroots groups, we recruit through all of our networks. So everything from binders on Facebook to former journalists to you know, folks who maybe just, you know, read about our program and send me a note and say, hey, what do you think about this? You know, I think of Stephanie Land, who was not connected to our grassroots groups, but she was on a Facebook group and I saw her piece that she wrote for Vox about being a maid. And I thought, this is a story, and this is a person I really want to bring into our network of storytellers. So it really runs the gamut in terms of our recruitment.
That's great.
And one other thing, just in terms of the question about how do we prevent folks from being exploited? I mean, the first, like, this is a storytelling program, and so and a leadership program, because we are building leaders as well in telling their stories and feeling confident about their stories. Like, people need to know that their truths matter. And so we, the folks that come in are folks who want to tell their stories, who feel like my story will have an impact in how we view these issues. And it's exactly what Charon was saying about not just changing the narrative, but it's changing the narrator. I mean, that was such a key way, and a key way of phrasing it, so that the folks that are coming on want to be these narrators.
That's a very good point. Bill, there was a question for you about, you mentioned something about telling respectful stories, not ones that are trafficked or something, and the person would like to hear more about stories to avoid.
Sure, and I just want to also echo a pitch for story ideas, and I think my Twitter handle got misspelled. It's Bill D, like David Nichols. So please DM me. No, it could have been my fault. But in any case, anyone who's on the call, I'd love to hear your ideas or thoughts for stories that we should be doing. In terms of respectful stories, what I mean by that is, again, focusing on potential solutions and staying away from, I mean, the terminology poverty porn is often used, but this idea of focusing on the conditions that people are living in rather than focusing on people as human beings who deserve the same rights and services that the rest of us do. And I'll give you another example. We did a story, I guess this has been a couple of years ago, one of the first pieces that we did on the reemergence of hookworm, which had not been seen in the United States in decades in rural Alabama. Now, in my opinion, the wrong way to do that story would have been focusing on the conditions in which hookworm was breeding. These were very, very poor people without a lot of infrastructure in terms of housing. But we tried to flip that and focus it more on the city, the county, the state, and what the hell were they doing? Why weren't they coming in? I mean, don't people deserve the right to live without a microbe that was thought to have been eradicated decades ago? They deserve clean water. They deserve sewage that's not contaminated. So I think that too often, and again, this I'm speaking more of the traditional media, dwells exclusively on the problem, on the photograph that may present a gripping image, but one that doesn't really speak to the truth of the life that that person is living. The other thing that we try to do, and I think you've heard this from all of us, is have people propose and write stories who are living it, or who are at least in the areas where the story is coming. Lots of people did stories about proposals for work requirements for Medicaid. My home state of Kentucky had one of the most draconian. And, you know, you could drop a reporter into Eastern Kentucky who could do that story. They probably wouldn't do it very well. We found a young woman who had grown up in Eastern Kentucky and in the mountains there, who did a terrific story because she understood the people, she understood the context, she understood the way of life. So I hope that answers the question.
No, that's great. We have another question for anyone, but maybe I'll put this to Charon since we haven't had a question for you yet. How do you talk about the intersection of race and poverty without alienating white people impacted by poverty?
I was trying to get off mute. Yes, that's a great question, and I think is key to the campaign. And we talk a lot about how you have to both aggregate and disaggregate statistics around poverty. And I think part of that is recognizing that they're both, you know, more poor white folks than in terms of sheer numbers in the country. And at the same time, people of color are disproportionately impacted in percentages, right? And so in order to understand the problem of poverty, we actually have to understand all of that. And so thinking about the intersections of race and poverty, part of it is actually bringing together both poor white folks and people of color to be talking about their experiences. And so I think partly part of the challenge on the organizing end is a lot of people don't actually organize poor white folks. And so in the campaign, we've been really intentional about the need to bring, poor white folks and poor communities of color together, and to do that across the state. And part of even thinking about, some of the organizing tours that we did most recently this spring was really, was getting out into different parts of our states that might not be as organized, and being able to connect, through what might not be traditionally seen as organizing, whether it be folks that are organizing, in healthcare clinics or in soup kitchens, and being able to sit down and have real conversations with folks that are across race, and to hear, start from the starting point of like, how are your communities hurting? And that might, manifest itself a little bit differently, but actually having those conversations and being able to put forward those stories, I think is actually really powerful for people to understand and to see then the connections. And so I think partly the question of alienating white folks on the question of poverty is that we just don't talk about white poverty often. And so it's actually bringing it to the table, but alongside of also understanding the ways that, that poverty and is connected to systemic racism, and actually that continues to manifest the problem of economic inequality on how it's impacting all of us because of the way it divides our communities, especially.
Great.
And if I can just add to that super
Sure.
quickly, just from an editorial standpoint, with what we do, it's very much in keeping with what I was talking about. Just because if we're a site that is presenting ourselves as presenting a comprehensive view of poverty in the United States, and the images that you see on our site are of people of color on every story, we're doing a terrible job. So that's something that we've tried to be very aware of, and to do stories that haven't traditionally been done. A piece that we did recently was looking at the prospects for universal basic income, which I think is traditionally viewed as sort of an urban panacea, and in many cases those are people of color who may be living in those areas where UBI trials are taking place. What would it look like in rural America? So we did a piece out of West Virginia talking to people about if UBI came into West Virginia and Kentucky, and could that be a useful policy? So I think it's a great question, and something that all of us are very aware of.
Yeah, there's so many great questions here to ask, and we only have a few more minutes. Maybe I'll kind of summarize two of them that are similar and see which one of y'all are most interested in. One of them is for Marisol about helping storytellers get away from an individualistic perspective, like how, people have internalized the narrative, but how do you get them to speak to systemic problems? And then the other question was for Marisol and Bill about, and I guess also for Charon, is about impact. Like, how have you seen this type of journalism or this type of organizing shifting the narrative and actually changing policy? I don't know who would like to answer those.
I can jump into the first one and answer a little of my thoughts on the second, but that's a really good question, right? Because that is part of the narrative that we are trying to do away with, and have folks who have lived experience establish the true narrative, right? I mean, so much of what we're hearing, particularly from the other side, is that, and people internalize this, if you are poor, it is your fault. You are lazy, you are not working hard enough, whatever. I mean, like you're a woman, you're Black, you're Latina, whatever that all looks like. So much of how we, you chose not to go to college, whatever, is there's a narrative somewhere that's kind of high up and amorphous around what is poverty. And one of the areas around our particular program, and this is when I was talking about it also as a leadership program, right, is that having people appreciate, accept, learn that their stories are their own and that they have value, number one. But number two, we really break it down with them, like, okay, well, so you struggled with generational poverty all of your life. Tell me a little bit about your family. Your family goes back to farmers and day laborers for 6 generations, right, in the rural South. And so then we start to dissect, well, where did you own your land? Did your family own your land? Well, no, they couldn't because of, they were sharecroppers. And so we start to kind of like work through their history, when they came to this country, maybe if they were immigrants, and it's really individualistic for us in terms of getting to know our fellows and really working them through, right? Like there's a little bit of like, we are also there, getting them on the couch and then they're talking to us about it because we really want to get them to a place where they are seeing like, oh, wait a minute. I went to a school in the Bronx, in the height of the Bronx, where, 70% of the kids, I don't know, didn't go to college, right? And half didn't even graduate. That's not me. That was systemic. And so really, so much of our work is really around helping and working with folks as part of the leadership portion of this program to understand and to see that. Now, many of our people, I will say that many of our folks, particularly those who come to us from our grassroots organizations, they're already there. They're like down with the program. They understand. And many of the people that I work with, even when they don't come through grassroots, they understand that there is a system out there that was not made for them. When they have to be trying to get food stamps and they have to go through 75,000 bureaucratic hoops and they have to leave work and not get paid so they could sit online and be able to bring the 18,000 piece of paper that they've shared, folks are coming in understanding there is a system here that doesn't want me to have the resources that I have. There is a system here that's kept me living where I live. Like there's a lot of the folks that I work with, like even if they don't come to us from a grassroots groups, they get it. They understand that things are not stacked in their favor in any way, shape, or form. And then the other thing I was just going to add when we talk about how we're seeing this play out in terms of narratives, for us, we do we're a C3 and a C4. So I'm going to put my C4 hat on for a second. But where we see narrative play out is when we start hearing presidential candidates. Elizabeth Warren, for example, coming out with the child care plan, where she talks about how the providers, who are mostly women of color, need to be paid living wages. When we have folks like Bernie Sanders, I'm not taking a position on one candidate over the other, I'm just sharing sort of platforms that you start to hear our narrative spoken about in a much more truer way. So Bernie Sanders talking about healthcare, Castro talking about the need for a pathway to citizenship for immigrants. When we start seeing elected leaders speaking in the same kind of language around, wait a minute, we all have to thrive, and by all we mean all, and here are some potential solutions, really following the pillars method. That's one way that we on our end are certainly seeing some of the changes that we're working towards.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much. Well, I think we should wrap up. I really want to thank you again, Marisol, Bill, and Charon, for being part of today's webinar. I want to remind folks that are on the call or who are listening in to check out the pillars at our website, opportunityagenda.org. And if you have any questions about today's material, please feel free to reach out to us or tweet me at Twitter at Will Coley. And we're sending you a link with this recording and the PowerPoint as a follow-up so you can share with any of the colleagues who couldn't make it today. And as you close out a GoToWebinar, a short evaluation is going to pop up. Please fill it out so we can make sure that we're offering the best possible content to partners in the future. So thanks again, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.